Hello, folks, and welcome to week 2 of our recorded lectures for HI 121. This is Dying Well in Egypt, Pyramids, Mummies, and Books of the Dead. So given the case study nature of this course, this was an obvious choice for a topic. Mummies, pyramids, the nature of the Egyptian afterlife, these are parts of the ancient world that are still with us, that we're still fascinated by today. And you should take a moment or two to think about why that is. Now, we're going to hop around a fair bit in this lecture. I want to touch on a number of different things. So to start off with, a few words on early funeral practices in Egypt. So the early Egyptian farming cultures in Lower Egypt, which is the part of Egypt that is closer to the Mediterranean, tended to bury their bodies, the bodies of their dead in the desert, in pits. There would be rarely any significant grave goods, no sign of textile wrappings. But what would happen is that the sand would actually preserve the bodies. This is a sort of informal, accidental mummification. So we have to speculate, did the early Egyptians notice this process of natural mummification? Did it actually inspire the formation of religious belief? Now, we do over time see the appearance of grave goods and more sophisticated tombs, especially with elite burials. Around 3000 BCE, the Egyptians began to cover burial pits with what are known as mastabas, which are mud brick platforms. So this is now a shift from a pit to a tomb. And rapidly, tombs became even more elaborate, especially amongst the elite. So we see, for instance, the development of palace facade tombs, where there is an underground chamber for the dead, plus a superstructure that contained rooms for storage, oftentimes with a specific decorative pattern that we see on early royal palaces. Now, a word or two on religious philosophy and the realm of the dead to explain all of this. So in Egyptian religion, death is a passage to the afterlife. It is a change. It is not an end. If it is an end, it is only the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The concept of the realm of the dead, which is sometimes called the land that loves silence, or the beautiful West. And West, of course, is because that's where the sun sets. Cemeteries were usually on the west bank of the Nile. This contributes to a perception that the afterlife is an extension of this life. So the dead person is going to have similar needs in the afterlife that they do in this life, hence grave goods. Now, the grave goods within the chambers are things from daily life. Furniture, jewelry, games, weapons, cosmetics, food, sometimes lots of food. That's important for the tomb owner's continuing existence after death, as we'll discuss. Although we do start to see a change to using models rather than objects themselves, especially of expensive objects. You don't want to bury objects that can be used by the living. Grave robbery is also a concern. Now, tombs of much larger size obviously couldn't be built right after the person died, so we see staircases being built, as in the picture, to allow for access to the underground chambers. So this meant the tomb could be buried, could be created ahead of time, and the body and the goods added after death. So this seems to have been almost a conceptual leap. By the Second Dynasty, tombs look like the underground copies of houses, and the mastabas are usually much simpler. Everything that's needed is below. Now, we also see the appearance of stelae. Stelae are stone monuments set up at the mastaba. At first, they just tell people who's in there. But then later, they would include lists of grave goods. They're hard to translate because hieroglyphs are not that well developed at that point. But if you compare with other lists, they seem to be food, oil, linens, things that were required for mummification and for the survival of the dead person from a religious standpoint. Okay, so as we move on into the Third Dynasty, which is the beginning of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, there are more death-related innovations. So coffins become typical of elite burials. Sometimes these are stone sarcophagi, but more usually they're wood. And they're decorated with pictures, the tombs, showing scenes of daily life. But you also see a decrease in grave goods in the Third and the Fourth Dynasty. The chambers become smaller, and the tomb stelae become more important. This is a shift. It could be towards efficiency, it's a natural extension of not wanting to waste goods, but also a fear of the increased looting of tombs, which is an ongoing problem throughout Egyptian history. And there were several very sporadic but very violent blow-ups of tomb robbery. Now, around this same time, despite the lesser quantities of grave goods and what looks like a slightly more straightforward approach to building some type of monument for the dead, instead we also see the first truly monumental examples of elite tombs, the pyramids. I've always thought this was funny. Again, tombs are becoming less sophisticated, and yet you have the pyramids at the same time. So the first pyramid is the step pyramid of Djoser, built at Saqqara around 2650 BCE. And it was made out of stone that had to be imported, granite from Aswan, limestone from the other side of the Nile. Really, primarily stone buildings are only an option for the rich and the powerful at this point in history. The logistics are simply not good. Djoser was actually a very successful pharaoh. He ruled for 19 years. He opened up mining and trading and increased literacy. And he built his pyramid at Saqqara near the major royal capital of Memphis. Now, his pyramid was surrounded by a whole complex of other buildings, so other tombs, a mortuary temple where the king's body would be mummified, even smaller pyramids, and also a serdab. Now, a serdab is a small room with a statue of the pharaoh, and his spirit could live there in the statue if something had happened to his body. So he has a bit of a backup plan. Now, essentially, the step pyramid is an elaboration on a mastaba tomb, driven by new theological ideas. So the steps of the pyramid would bring the king's spirit closer to the sun. And if you look inside the pyramid, you also see that several of the rooms are tiled in blue, evoking the Nile. Burial chambers, not so much, obviously. There's almost a private palace inside the step pyramid. The king needed it, apparently, after he was dead. Okay, so our next major pharaoh to talk about is Snefru. Snefru died around 2613 BCE, and he built 3 pyramids. They were surrounded by other mastaba tombs, usually his family, and interesting presence of chapels with very detailed relief images of daily life. These images showed everything necessary for the afterlife. Now, most of these tombs were robbed, but we can't assume they weren't stuffed to bursting with grave goods to start with. We have one unlooted tomb from Snefru's reign. This is the tomb of Hetepheres. This was possibly his wife, which would have made her the mother of Khufu. And this does tell us that grave goods are still used. The tomb contained pottery, including foreign imports. It contained models of other vessels, jewelry, a set of gilt furniture that was really quite impressive. You have a reproduction there in the image. There were 2 armchairs, a carrying chair, a bed, a box, and a canopy. The bed and the canopy in particular are depicted in other tombs, so there's maybe a religious thing here, something connected to rebirth. Now, the most famous of Snefru's pyramids is the Bent Pyramid at Dashur. We'll show you a picture of that shortly. The architects may have realized that they were trying to build too high, that the pyramid's line of ascent was too steep, so they had to change the angle. And because this pyramid was so big, the blocks were huge and very, very difficult to move. Now, because of its steepness, it also still has a strong, has a significant proportion of its outer casing, which is unusual for pyramids. Now, the red pyramid was his second kick at the can, and we'll see an image of it as well. It is much more gently sloped, and it is an interesting shade of red because of the iron oxides in the stones. But because it is so much less steep, its limestone sheathing was stolen. All right, there's the bent pyramid. So you can see where they got to a certain spot and went, oh, wait, whoops, not good, and had to change what they were doing. It's really incredible to think that they were able to create these things by trial and error, effectively. You know, the goal was to get it big, to get it impressive, and how they did that without the modern tools that we have, or even some of the more sophisticated math that we have. It's pretty impressive. That is the red pyramid. So as you can see, it's a very different look, much more gradual rise, plus the red color of the stone. All right, here are the big ones. The pyramids at Giza. These are built in the Fourth Dynasty. There is a whole burial complex here. There are smaller pyramids that you can actually see, tombs and graves, likely for queens and other family members. Now, there's also a boat buried in a pit outside Khufu's pyramid. And ask yourself, did it actually take his mummy across the Nile to be buried? Or was it simply a religious object, a solar barge? Hard to say. There's some indication from it that it was used in water and that it was fully sized. It is 143 feet long, as you cannot quite tell from this picture. There was a boat builder who reassembled the pieces over the course of 14 years. Now, it turns out this wasn't actually the only boat in the funeral complex. There was another that was sealed, that was opened in 2011, and 3 more that were opened that appeared to have held boats but were now empty. Now, boat burials are not uncommon in Egypt. There are a large number of them, actually. So the Great Pyramid, or the Pyramid of Khufu, has a large gallery with 26-foot tall walls. This gallery leads to the king's chamber, where there is a very large red granite sarcophagus, but no body. The second pyramid in this complex is Khafre's pyramid. It is actually smaller than Khufu's, but because it's on higher ground, it looks taller. The belief in the Greek and Roman period is that this pyramid was actually solid. But in the 19th century, Giovanni Belzoni, the Italian investigative archaeologist, decided that he would discover the secrets of the pyramid. So he managed to find his way in, but he found Arabic graffiti from the 13th century, claiming that the king had opened the tomb 600 years before. Now, Belzoni, of course, is the only logical thing for any archaeologist to do in the 19th century. And he scratches his name right alongside the medieval graffiti. So Giovanni Belzoni was here. 19th century archaeologists. Now, the Pyramid of Onas, built 200 years later, is much smaller because Onas wasn't as wealthy. This was a time of great climate change, food shortages, hard times basically for Egypt. Now, one of the things that Onas's pyramid has, which is absolutely remarkable, are the pyramid texts. And they are carved on the inside of the burial chamber. It's the first hieroglyphic writing within a pyramid that we have. It was easily enough done because the funeral chamber was lined in alabaster and painted. Can you imagine walking into that burial chamber and looking up with your light and seeing this? It's just, it floors me, the impact that must have had. Later pyramids, those from the Middle Kingdom, have not survived as well. They tended to make very heavy use of mud brick, which is simply not as resilient. So Amenemet's Black Pyramid at Dashur, for instance, has partially collapsed. It is an interesting monument. It provides chambers for 2 of his queens within the pyramid itself. There's an image of it from the back. Now, in the New Kingdom, we see kings beginning to favor rock-cut tombs instead. This is the Valley of the Kings, or Valley of the Queens we're talking about. It's easier to protect tombs sealed in rock like that. If it's a pyramid, everybody knows where your grave goods are. Now, one of the questions that often comes up with the pyramids is, were they built by slaves? Certainly the Greeks believed so, but we believe that most of the workers would have been farmers with less to do when their crops were growing. There was, for sure, a professional construction class, stonemasons, carpenters, and artists. We know that because they were buried in a basically workman's cemetery near the Giza pyramids. Now, the process of construction does remain something of a mystery. It leads to all kinds of pseudo-historical explanations. I'm a medievalist by trade. You wouldn't think that medieval people could build Gothic cathedrals either. But craftsmen find a way. Oftentimes, it's through trial and error, like what we saw with the pyramids, and, the ones that worked and the ones that didn't. Okay, let's move on now to mummies. So why mummify the dead? Well, that's a complicated answer, and I'll try and break it down for you into something relatively succinct. Basically, Egyptians did not have a simple division between body and soul. They believed that a man was a composite of physical and non-physical elements, or keperu. Now, death is a form of transfiguration into something that's almost close to the divine. But in order to do this, you still needed a physical form for your ka, or your life force, to inhabit. It still needed food, and food and drink offerings made at tombs. Now, there are other aspects at work, too, other parts of your being that were dependent on the preservation of your physical form. For instance, the heart has to be specially preserved. It is seen as the locale of the memory and the intellect, and you needed your heart if you're going to control your own fate in the afterlife. Mummification takes on its more complex form by the time of the Fourth Dynasty, and this is because of the use of natron. Natron is a natural salt used to absorb moisture. They would put bags of it within the abdominal cavity. Now, the wealthy could pay for their bodies to be oiled, perfumed, stuffed with spices instead of mud or rags. They could also pay for amulets to be bound into the wrappings. The quality of the whole process depended on your wealth. And Herodotus actually tells us about 3 grades of mummification. He might have been oversimplifying things a bit, but I would say probably this was generally a good observation, because it did point out to us that commoners would have to go for the cheaper process, and that could include just smearing bitumen on mummies, and that doesn't preserve them very well, and that is why we see later period mummies are much more decayed. It's possible that this is true simply because there was so much more demand for mummification. Now, a few notes on the study of mummies. Egyptology really begins after Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. He was accompanied by scientists and antiquarians. And by the early 19th century, European diplomats are approaching the Egyptian government for, whatever they can get, any kind of artifacts, even if it's just mummy bodies. Now, in return, they would be giving out political and financial favors, so this looked like a good exchange from the perspective of the politicians. That being said, Egyptian scholars themselves were not at all pleased by it. So we see a gradual process of Egypt kind of waking up to the fact that they're letting their cultural heritage walk out the door until the Egyptian Antiquities organization is formed to help regulate things a little bit more effectively. They're not infallible. Stuff still gets stolen and taken out of the country. But there are a number of things, even in a museum like the ROM, that are only there because someone stole them. This is something we're going to talk about much later in the term, the ethics of museum work under these conditions. Now, mummies. I don't really know how to put this apart from saying mummies had many different afterlives. So, mummy unwrappings were often after dinner entertainment in Europe. Yes, really. There's a strange sort of attitude towards Egypt amongst the British and their colonies. They see Egypt as sort of an original source of civilizing values and believe that having bits and pieces of the Egyptian past set on display in the museums was supposed to be uplifting for their new populations. There's also a nasty racial edge. Some scientists wanted the heads of mummies because they believed that they showed the ancient Egyptians were Caucasian. So, of course, the Europeans should have control over Egypt's resources, right? If they're the descendants and all. I hope you all are realizing how ridiculous that sounds. Now, there are numerous other uses for mummies. Mummies had been consumed as medicine since the 12th century CE. In the modern period, you see common mummies or decayed mummies being shipped to Britain or Germany and ground up as fertilizer. Artists also used paint that was made out of mummy material. This is mostly in the 19th century. It was called mumia. It was mummy pieces mixed with bitumen. So I think what this speaks to is a real ambivalence about mummies, based on Christian concepts of death versus Egyptian customs. Also might have been inspired by a bit of worry about disturbing burials. This is something that is sort of inculcated into our culture, that you don't do that. Some people may have been bothered by the use of mummies in all of these ways because they felt the mummy had been a person who deserved better than to be treated like this in death, and I gotta say, I have some sympathy for that. So perhaps it's not such a surprise that the mummy plays such an enduring and strange role in popular culture. Okay, so let's close things out by talking about the afterlife. Important thing to remember about Egyptian death rituals: they are all originally for the ruler. They are for his use only, and then they're expanded to non-royal persons. So this means we have different concepts existing side by side for centuries upon centuries. The different doctrines are not sophisticated, are not synthesized rather into any one true doctrine, which tells us something interesting about Egyptian society. There's something for everyone. Now, the earliest texts are the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom that I mentioned earlier. In these texts, the king is depicted as ascending to the sky, joining the stars. This is eventually superseded by other myths about Osiris and Ra. Now, we get the most complete version of the Osiris myth through Plutarch. Obviously, this is not the original. It's an interpretation through classical Greek eyes. So, basically, he depicts Osiris as an ancient civilizing monarch of Egypt who taught his people law and agriculture. He's murdered by his brother Set. He's cut into pieces, and the pieces are scattered around Egypt. His wife Isis and another goddess, Nephthys, track down all the pieces except one key piece, poor Osiris. Anubis mummifies the corpse, and Osiris is resurrected to become the ruler of the dead. Now, his son Horus had sought vengeance for him. He had overthrown Set and avenged his father's murder, so he now becomes the king of the living. Now, all Egyptians can identify with Osiris in death. The texts would give the deceased the protection of all of the relevant good gods of the Osiris myth. And Osiris has connections to fertility. I mean, the missing piece when he was put back together was his phallus, right? Isis miraculously restores it. So he is connected with the floods of the Nile and the life cycle of vegetation. There are layers and layers of metaphor for resurrection in the Osiris story. Now, the other major set of afterlife myths involve Ra, the sun god, and his night journey. So he travels the night in a solar barge, through a series of caverns populated by various good and evil divine beings. His light awakens the dead to new life as he travels, and before the night is over, he fights Apep, a giant serpent, and that is, by the way, in the image Ra in the form of a cat fighting Apep in the form of a servant. In the 5th hour of his journey, he encounters his own corpse, and the two are reunited. So each new day, as he reaches the east, is a repetition of the creation of the universe every time the sun rises. Now, in some of the pyramid texts, the king spends his afterlife traveling with the sun god across the sky. Later in the Middle Kingdom, everyone can identify with Ra. We see this in the coffin texts, which evolved from the pyramid texts and were usually written on the insides of coffins. We also see this in the books of the dead. This is the next stage of evolution. These are not, I don't want to say dumbed down, they are designed to be accessible to all, and sometimes they are customized for a particular person. They were first written, we believe, on mummy wrappings, but later on papyrus scrolls. Now, by the New Kingdom, everyone can travel with Ra. You share in his resurrection, and you fight his foes. And if you want to achieve immortality, that is to become Ak, where you are integrated into the cyclical patterns of the universe, you could only achieve this if you pass through tests and dangers and were properly prepared. Now, the pyramid texts put the realm of the dead in the northern sky. The coffin texts call it the underworld, the kingdom of Osiris. The coffin texts actually talk a great deal about how to traverse the underworld, where to go and where not to go, that sort of thing. Now, the judgment of the dead, that comes about originally in the period after the fall of the old kingdom. So what happens is that the dead are judged to be either righteous or wicked. The wicked are punished. The transfigured righteous often wind up in the field of reeds or the field of offerings, just sort of paradise. What happens in the actual test is Anubis puts the deceased heart on one of the scales. On the other, the goddess Ma'at puts a feather. And Ma'at is really a personification of truth. She's not so much of a goddess specifically. Now, the deceased would then have to swear that he had committed no crime. If he was telling the truth and no judgment was the judgment was positive, the heart stayed lighter than the feather. If not, if the heart was heavy, the deceased would be, he'd fail first of all, and secondly, he would often be devoured by Amut, the devourer of the dead. But here's the problem. Egyptians aren't idiots. They know that people are not sinless, right? So, what do you do in order to kind of get around the fact that you probably did some bad things in your life? Egyptian belief was modified with an out. So to keep your heart quiet about things that Odin didn't want to know or need to know, you could be buried with the symbol of an amulet, a scarab with a human head, inscribed with a protective spell. And this is what some varieties of them said. Do not stand up against me. Do not witness against me. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not incline against me. That is put over the heart, because that is the dead person talking to their heart, saying, please don't do anything rash. Now, I'm hoping what you're seeing here is how environmental factors and religion and burial practices and architecture, social trends, economics, all of it feeds into each other and shapes how Egyptians approach death. Okay, that should do it for us for this topic, and I will be back to you soon with the Incense Road. Thanks very much, guys.